Welcome to everyone in person and the large number of people who are joining us online as well. Welcome to this event. I am your compere for the day. My name is EJ Milner-Gulland. My first pleasure and privilege is to welcome Anusha Shah, our host, to the chair.
Thank you very much, EJ. Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure to see you all gathered here to discuss the topic, nature, on which our very existence depends. So before I start, just some housekeeping. There are no fire alarms scheduled for today. So if you hear an alarm, it's the real one. So please follow the signs outside, and the IC staff will escort you out in an area outside where we'll assemble. So it gives me immense pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you in 1 Great George Street, the home of civil and infrastructure engineering. This is the place from where the ICE has contributed significantly to shaping and defining our world for more than 200 years. As you look around the building, you will see some beautiful paintings and portraits, and there are stories of engineers and technicians who've transformed our world for the better. But the world the engineers of the past envisioned in the 2 centuries since the ICE was founded, it has changed. I mean, hardly a day goes by, if you switch on the TV, you see a climate event somewhere around the world, be it flooding, water scarcity, wildfires, and here in the UK, we're already facing a 3rd heat wave. The reservoir levels are at the lowest, and there are hosepipe bans. And we know there's enough evidence, there's enough data that this is going to get worse. And this is really important to kind of pause and think. It's how it impacts the health, especially the health of our vulnerable people, our elderly people. So we face a climate and nature emergency where the role of engineering infrastructure is rightly challenged. But with this challenge, almost certainly the greatest of our lifetime comes our greatest opportunity. The IC's Royal Charter defines civil engineering as the art of directing the great sources of power in nature. We now know that the power is not infinite. We have the chance to transform how we give society the infrastructure it needs, but not by working against nature, but in a way that gives back to nature. We have built infrastructure that has served society, but we also know that somewhere we have been guilty as infrastructure professionals because we have really led to the decline in nature. The construction itself is contributing to approximately 30% of biodiversity loss globally. So it's really, really important to know that we need to regenerate nature and really move from just being sympathetic to nature to being nature positive. It's moving away from sustainability to regenerating nature. So growing up in Kashmir, the Indian side, almost like, so that's where I was born and brought up, and it really shaped me personally, professionally, and spiritually. And in nature, I found my ikigai. Ikigai, for most of you who may know, is a Japanese concept of reason for being. And that's why I made, as IC's 159th president last year, I made my presidential theme as making connections for a nature and people positive world. I made the case that we as engineers and infrastructure professionals need to do more than just build assets. We need to build connections between climate and nature, connections between people and nature, connections with one another, and connections with different industries, sectors, with communities we serve. So quite frankly, connections between sectors, geographies, and generations. And I think I've traveled around the world to many regions as president, and I can tell you no country, no region, no organization has all the answers. There's some great pockets of amazing projects happening where truly nature and people has been at the heart. But they're in pockets, and we have to learn from each other. Global South needs to learn from Global North, and Global North needs to learn from Global South. So I think it's really important to understand, and I think this room knows it very well, but it's worth repeating, is nature is not just luxury. it's the form of infrastructure. And we often think of infrastructure as roads, bridges, power grids, and buildings, visible, engineered, and measurable. But just as essential are the forests that regulate our water supply, the wetlands that buffer our coastlines, the soil that supports our food systems, and the green spaces that cool our cities and support public health. And nature does not need to compete with infrastructure, it complements it. It strengthens it, in many cases outperforms at times in cost and durability. Consider mangroves that protect shorelines better than concrete seawalls during storms, and sometimes you need a blended approach as well. Or urban trees that reduce heat and energy use more effectively than cooling systems alone. Or watersheds that filter and store drinking water more sustainably than many man-made alternatives. But we have to think about not go straight to a gray concrete infrastructure, have the nature-first approach. And at times there are trade-offs, at times it's not possible, but having that nature-first mindset is very, very important. And I would say, and yet these, sometimes these natural systems are really accounted for in our budgets, in our planning processes, in our risk assessments. And I would say, nature is always omitted from our asset registers, where nature is the biggest asset. And it's the biggest asset class in financial terms. So that omission costs us economically, socially, and environmentally. So as government leaders and decision makers today, many of you are in the room, you are the architects of public policy and infrastructure investment. You shape not only what gets built, but how it endures. And we now have a clear opportunity to integrate natural infrastructure alongside engineered solutions to build smarter, greener, more resilient communities. So nature-based infrastructure doesn't just protect us from future risks, it delivers multiple benefits. And especially in a resource-constrained world when we are constantly talking about budgets being cut, this is so important: multifunctional infrastructure, clean air, healthier populations, local jobs, biodiversity, and long-term cost savings. What's not to like? And it often reaches the people most in need, those who live in vulnerable or underserved areas, where nature can serve as a frontline defense. So I think it's not just, I want to leave you with that nature is not just a line on a sustainability report. It is our climate defense. It is our health policy. It is our health and well-being defense. And if we are smart, we can really build in a way that it doesn't have to be an added cost. It's well integrated in what we do. It's about realizing that a bridge built through a restored floodplain or a city plan that includes living green corridors is not just environmentally sound, it's economically wise. It's a business case. Like someone rightly said, there is no business on a nature-depleted planet. So I think and as an immediate past president, I have carried on with a lot of projects that I started as president. For example, I'm really keen to, alongside climate, we get nature in our new engineering contract, new NEC contracts as a clause, so people have nature at the forefront when planning and designing. With my future leaders, so every president has future leaders shadowing. I had 8 really bright young professionals with me, and we've started, and we've realized the biggest blocker is the financial community is not speaking to the engineers, and there's a big communication gap. So we are really working on an AI-powered platform that really, it's a matchmaking platform. So the financial professionals have the data, they can see where the pipeline of projects is, and equally built environment professionals can see where the finance is for nature-based solutions. And I'm also working with Joseph, and I'm planning to pull together a group post this session to see how do we really help from an infrastructure world to really understand the Green Book and understand how to use the Green Book in the best way that we alongside cost benefit, natural capital gets an equal footing. And also, so I really kind of invite you all to see nature not as an afterthought, and I think this room pretty well knows that, but as a core component of every decision we make. So when we plan infrastructure, we must ask, how can nature help us to do this better, cheaper, and more cost effectively and more sustainably? So let this gathering make a turning point, I would say, where nature becomes not a separate agenda, but a shared one, a cross-sector priority, a pillar of our public policy, because the future we build literally depends on how well we partner with the natural systems that already protect and sustain us. And I just want to leave you with a quote by one of the poets and Nobel laureate, Rabindranath Tagore, who said, the person who plants a tree knowing that he or she will not sit under its shade has understood life. So with that, I will pass on to EJ. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Thank you, Anusha, and thank you for this really wonderful venue. Our next speaker needs no introduction, but just briefly, Sir Dave Lewis is a highly successful businessman who chaired Unilever for many years, was also the CEO of Tesco. I've known him for several years as the chair of the board of WWF UK, where he's been an incredibly effective chair and still is, and he's also involved with Xlinks, which is a renewable energy company. So Dave speaks from experience about the need for this kind of gathering. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you, EJ. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. As you know, British people care deeply about wildlife. Combined membership of environmental and wildlife organisations in the UK is a little more than 8 million people. In fact, WWF UK, which I have the privilege to chair, has more than 1 million supporters alone. And we have a wonderful national self-image as a green and pleasant land. But despite this, the UK is amongst the 10 most nature-depleted countries in the world. A quarter of UK mammals are at risk of extinction from the UK, and we've lost 97% of our wildlife meadows since 1930s. 73 million birds have disappeared from the UK since 1970s. Now, there are occasional positive stories to tell, some successful reintroduction programs like the red kite and the big large blue butterfly, but these are very minor gains against an overwhelming set of losses on the other side of the ledger. The pace of change is astonishing, and sadly, it's accelerating. Now, there are a range of reasons for this, as you well know, but habitat destruction is by far and away the greatest, and the biggest factor is the clearance and the conversion of natural land to make way for agriculture. Overexploitation, such as overfishing, is also a major cause. And now we see climate change rapidly growing threat with droughts, wildfires, floods, and other extreme events. Can never say desertification, don't know why. And changes of the food web have driven rising temperatures, and they all affect wildlife. So it's not a very uplifting start to what I have to say, but it is important that we need to be clear that we face a nature crisis. It's global. If you look at the WWF Living Planet report, last year it showed that monitoring wildlife populations have declined by an average of 73% since 1970. But it is also local, and therefore very much our collective responsibility to respond and begin to rebuild nature. Now, the UK is committed to do so on the global stage. It signed up to the agreements to protect 30% of both land and sea for nature by 2030, following the biodiversity COP in 2022. It's in all of our interests to respond because the nature crisis doesn't just affect the wild species and places that I and we and so many in the British public value so much. Every drop of water we drink, every breath we take, and every mouthful of food we eat, we owe to a functioning natural world. So longer droughts, more severe floods, barren soils, disappearing pollinators, increasingly lifeless oceans, they threaten the very future of our societies and of the economies around the world that are all built on these functioning ecosystems. Now, this is widely recognized by economists and business leaders. Earlier this decade, the World Economic Forum released a report showing that half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. The Dasgupta review commissioned by the Treasury and reporting in 2021 was clear that the significant biodiversity declines are undermining the productivity, resilience, and adaptability of nature, and this in turn puts our economics, our livelihoods, and our well-being at risk. The problem is these risks are not easy to capture in the economic models the Treasury and other forecasters rely on. systemic, cascading, and compound risk from ecosystem collapse, which can transfer from one region to another via failed insurance policies or global commodity markets, could have economic impacts at a scale way beyond the losses we've experienced, even through events like the global financial crisis. But some of these risks are evident already to businesses and communities. I know some of them well myself, given that agriculture and food and beverages are among the sectors that depend most heavily on nature. Supply chains, both local and global, lean heavily on robust and resilient natural systems. So what really concerns me is that governments have failed to be clear and grasp this reality. They've seen the same science and data as we have. They know the risks and they're aware of the opportunities. But they have sent very inconsistent signals to business about where nature sits in their priorities, and too often portrayed it as a barrier to growth. Now, I don't want to relitigate the planning and infrastructure bill in detail. I think EJ may have a few things to say on that a little later. But if the UK is to deliver net zero by 2050, a clean power system by 2030, and economic growth now, then of course we need to build. And the planning bill could present an opportunity to bring more private finance into nature restoration. But this should not be at the expense of our most precious sites for nature. And nor should paying into a nature restoration fund absolve business of their obligation to minimize harm. And the best buildings and the best funds in the world will not lead to the restoration of nature if we don't address the food and farming system, which accounts for 70% of the land use in the UK and is the biggest driver of nature loss here and indeed the rest of the world. It's reassuring to hear Steve Reed, the Environmental Secretary, tell a group of business leaders recently, just a few weeks ago in Lancaster House, nature underpins everything. Without it, there is no economy, no food, no health, and ultimately, no society. I agree. And by the way, so do more and more CEOs, boards, and investors. There is growing recognition in business of our dependence on nature, of the opportunities that restoring it entails, and the risks if we don't. Increasing numbers of businesses are engaging with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, with over 500 companies committing to disclose. I hope, with the government currently consulting on the commitment on net zero transition plans, that business will be given an even stronger push to include nature in those plans too. Remember, there really is no net zero without nature recovery. I can tell you from personal experience that nature is finally making its way onto the agenda of boards and executive teams. When businesses move away from measuring their environmental impact to recognizing the dependencies in their business models, all stakeholders recognize the need for a truly sustainable supply chain. An easy example is water. 94% of the products made by Reckitt, a major business partner of WWF, rely on water. So there's no future for their business model without healthy freshwater systems. GSK, who also work with WWF, is working hard in water-stressed regions of India and Pakistan to promote water stewardship in order to secure the long-term sustainability of its supply chains in those countries. These are good examples of businesses actively building nature and its stewardship into their work globally. But we don't need to look that far afield to see some evidence of companies taking action to both protect the environment and indeed their bottom line. John Lewis are protecting and restoring nature in Norfolk, which is a key sourcing region for their Waitrose supermarkets, but an increasingly dry one in summer as the UK climate warms. A more wildlife-rich landscape there will help secure the resilience of their supply chain. And Aviva published their latest transition plan last year, integrating nature into their financial decision-making and demonstrating how nature and biodiversity considerations are becoming core to their business strategy. With climate change producing periods of much more intense rainfall as well as droughts, they've worked with WWF to restore the natural flow of rivers in East Anglia in order to reduce flooding through, through natural flood management. So businesses are doing these things for one of three reasons, I think. They either see the economic necessity of a truly sustainable system, or they recognize and understand the moral, and the ethical importance of what responsible business looks like in the 21st century. So what does business want from government? The wheels of Whitehall certainly are slow to turn, but if we're to restore nature at the scale and the speed needed, it must become a whole government effort. This means dropping the bats, newts and blockers rhetoric and recognising at all levels of government that nature underpins everything. It means committing to nature as central to plans for climate action by planting trees and re-wetting peatlands, working with nature to help clean up our rivers and mitigate flooding, putting nature back everywhere to underpin a resilient food system. The opportunities of a new food system, a farming roadmap, a land use framework, a carbon budget delivery plan, and an environmental improvement plan are huge, but they need to be developed in tandem to be more than just the sum of the parts. The mission-based approach to government should be applied and challenged to look at our finite land and seas use to coherently restore nature, provide a secure supply of nutritious, healthy food, and tackle climate change. And to do so without exporting our environmental impact to those parts of the world that remain rich in biodiversity. Now, no country yet does this well, so the UK can lead, as it did with the Climate Change Act, through new legislation, and the WWF itself is calling for a Living Planet Act. In the immediate term, and ahead of climate COP30 in Brazil, the government can send a message to the world that it's serious about its environmental obligations and about leadership by implementing the due diligence regulations to take products from illegally deforested areas off our supermarket shelves. 4 Prime Ministers and 5 environmental secretaries have come and gone since these regulations were legislated for in the Environmental Act. And business is impatient to see their implementation. Just last week, 8 of the UK's largest retailers wrote to the business secretary calling for just that. I believe the business community is ready to partner government in building the net zero and nature positive economy, and to demonstrate that restoring nature and driving sustainable economic growth can and must go hand in hand. The recent increase in spending for nature-friendly farming is a good first step. We want and need the long-term clarity that only government can provide. WWF's work with DEFRA and the Green Finance Institute to develop nature-positive sectorial pathways will set out the expected contribution of sectors like agriculture, energy, and house building to nature's recovery, as we have done with climate. We want to see mandatory climate transition plans which set a high bar and incorporate nature. And we want the UK to lead in developing all aspects of the green economy. Government harnessing the innovation spirit of business to make us world leaders, not just in renewable energy and green technologies, but in working with nature to build resilience into the economy. In doing so, we secure our future and our prosperity. Thank you very much.
So Dave has to nip off at the end of his talk, so he's left 5 minutes.
Apologies.
It's been a pleasure having you. He's left 5 minutes for any questions, so Kiana will have a roving mic. So if anybody wants to stick a hand up and ask Dave something, or say something,
or not,
that would be great. Does anybody have anything? Yeah, for online.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. We did a project recently looking at food waste in Bristol and estimated that Bristol throws away £150 million of edible food every year.
Yep.
And also that there are sort of perverse economic incentives to supermarkets wanting to maintain that position. So I just wondered, as given your experience, what you think
subject
about that.
Close to my heart, actually. So full disclosure, for 3 years I chaired a group called Champions 12.3, which was part of the Sustainable Development Goals of halving food loss and waste. So a subject I'm very, very, very familiar with. And if you look at food waste in total globally, it's like the third largest. If it was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So it's a very, very, very big issue. To the UK, there are look, I can tell you running a supermarket is difficult. Trying to get 40,000 different lines to be exact, a balance of supply and demand every day in every location is really tough, right? And it's a tough gig. So you always end up with a shortage, or you always end up with a little surplus, and you're always trying to manage that. There are so many, though, really good schemes. So at Tesco, we built a system with a business called Food Cloud, which is a charity, which links Tesco stores to local social enterprises. You have to be very careful about donating food because it's got to be safe, right? So the idea that you donate, because look, the truth is when the legislation says that the sell-by date is gone, you can't legally sell it, but it's still safe to be eaten. So if you donate it rather than animal feed or, dare I say, energy recovery, you donate it, you've got to make sure that it's used properly. Right, so what we did with Fair Share and Food Cloud was certify, I think when I was there, 3,500 charities across the UK that were linked to the store. And every night the store manager sends a message with all the food which is surplus. It's then donated and then used in social purposes. So I don't think you get to a place where there isn't any food waste. I really, they would love to, economically they would love to, given the margins of the food business. They don't want it to be wasted. They don't want it to be wasted because if you're running a 2, 3, 4% margin business, a small amount of waste is economically really very difficult. So they don't want it to be wasted, but they recognise that there always will be. So the UK industry is around 3%, right? Tesco was about 1.5%. The industry is about 3%. These are old numbers. I've not been there for a few years. But you can donate it, and they do donate. So, we were talking about 10 million tonnes of food at that time in the UK. So I don't have the Bristol numbers in my head, but nationally the same issue is there. But there are things that can be done about it. So if you want to do something about encouraging people to be part of that donation scheme is one thing that can be done in the UK.
Okay, I think we can do one more quickly, if there's somebody else. Ian wants to ask something. Might be nice to introduce ourselves, actually, as we ask.
Okay. Hello, my name's Ian Bateman. I work at University of Exeter. A very impressive speech. I think you're the first business leader that I've really heard talk about the issue of leakage. Mm-hmm. So this is this problem that quite normally, a trading nation, we bring in a lot from around the world, and that's absolutely, that is part of the economy. It has been for this country for a very long time. Unfortunately, we have a lot of policies in place, such as, for example, taking land out of farming for conservation, which not only are they badly designed in that they don't actually help the species that are really on the edge of extinction, but also they obviously reduce food production. They don't compensate elsewhere by increasing food production elsewhere in the country. Therefore, they pull in imports. Mm-hmm. And that, in turn, leads to often very large offsetting losses in biodiversity, in carbon, that sort of stuff, around the world. Mm-hmm. To the extent that, a lot of the policies that we think are doing good, it's debatable if actually they're even net benefits because of this effect. Now, you're obviously in charge of massive industries that can, I believe, exert some influence upon decision makers. Mm-hmm. To what extent are you trying to explain these caveats with what on the surface look like good policies and trying to get government to actually help you to address leakage by, in effect, one way would be stopping it at source?
Yeah. I'll try and make a short answer to a very big subject. Look, I can assure you that the food industry that I was a part of when I was CEO of Tesco spent an awful lot of time trying to engage with government around what a food strategy would look like. Fairness to Theresa May, she actually agreed to actually go and look and design a food strategy. That was stimulated by the UK food retailers saying, we need a systemic approach to this. Look, we're an island. We've got limited amount of land. What do we want to use it for? think about what we want to produce, think about what it is we do need to import. We import about 50% of the food that we eat in the UK. So what and where matters. You should put that together with your health strategy, because what is it you want the population? So there's a real big opportunity to put health, climate, land, all of that together, and that's what started the food strategy work that Dimbleby first did, and that's where the land use work came from, actually, but stimulated by the food industry saying to the government, you need to be thinking about exactly this. Now, you can argue about how much effect that has had, but I can assure you that that food industry is very involved in saying, and I mentioned in my speech only a couple of weeks ago, the retailers in the UK were asking the business secretary again for guidance as to what do you want to do on some of these issues. But without government engagement, without a policy framework, there's not much you can do. People don't realize if retailers came together to agree, they will get into very serious trouble. Right? It's pre-competitive. You can't sit in a room and decide that actually we as an industry will change it. So you need government to set the policy framework. In fact, we did some work, so you may remember WWF, my involvement with WWF started at Tesco when we set up and funded this idea of the environmental impact of the average shopping basket. We then got all of the other retailers to sign up to that, and in COP in Glasgow, we announced that initiative. One of the byproducts of that was to get the CMA to agree that food retailers could come together and discuss some of the sustainability issues of the industry in line with government policy. But you need government policy. So it comes full circle. So the industry is interested, it's quite active, it needs an active partner on the other side of the table.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to Dave for coming and
pleasure.
a really inspiring speech. Thank you. Okay, so it falls to me to give a whistle-stop tour of the research and policy landscape in which we're sitting. So that's what I'm going to do for the next 25-ish minutes. So my lecture starts now, and maybe at tea time I'll be finished. I'm starting in 1992 with the Convention on Biological Diversity being formed at the Rio Summit, which was an incredibly important moment for nature when it was really coming up onto the international stage. Another kind of big strategic moment for nature was in 2010, and that was the first time when we had a proper strategic plan for biodiversity with proper targets that arguably could be measured against. And importantly also, that was the time at which the idea was mooted that governments would every now and again report against a national biodiversity strategy and action plan to show what progress they'd been making. And that was going to be, reviewed and transparent on an international stage. So a really important moment. At that point, we had a lovely vision that by 2050, everything would be great. We'd all be happy and healthy and sustainable on a wonderful planet. The mission that they put in for the short term was that by 2020, the loss of biodiversity would be halted. We signally failed as an international community to do that. Just before that 2020 milestone was reached, a really important modelling study was published by Leclerc et al. So they took the state of nature historically as it was going. So this is the thing that Dave was mentioning of the 73% decline in nature. So that's the black line of historical decline. The grey is business as usual, in which things continue to get dire. The point that Leclerc et al. Really wanted to make was that conservation by itself is not enough. That's the orange line. You can stabilise nature with your protected areas and that kind of thing, but you cannot reverse the loss of nature as requested by our international community. To do that, you have to change the economic system within which nature depletion is happening. You have to have more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption. And that is a really important message that still perhaps has not quite hit home. And then actually a couple of years late, the new Global Biodiversity Framework was signed in Montreal in December 2022, at which some new targets, perhaps slightly more smart, were agreed. had much the same vision of a happy planet by 2050, but our new 10-year mission did have a major change, which is that it now talked about halting and reversing biodiversity loss and putting nature on a path to recovery. And that's important, and that is what we in the conservation community are now taking as our North Star, our lodestone, whatever you want to call it. The equivalent of the 1.5 or 2 degrees for climate is this halt and reverse mission for biodiversity. And that's what all of the 196 signatories to the CBD are meant to be working towards now, and the clock is ticking. Currently, we have a lot of good stuff in our legislation, which we'll come to later, but what we don't have is that halt and reverse simple lodestar in legislation yet. There was a bill that didn't go any further on Friday that would have done that, the Climate and Nature Bill. So, following on from what Dave was saying about leakage and Ian's point, the reason why we need to have that halt and reverse kind of thing in legislation beyond our national level targets is exactly leakage. So we don't have really good stats yet about UK leakage into the international biodiversity footprint. This is a really nice study, though, that was done for Switzerland. This is the impact of Swiss food consumption, but only via freshwater extraction and eutrophication, because they're the only two things that they could really quantifiably look at. So this is the impact, the amount of water consumption and the amount of phosphorus in emissions around the world from Swiss consumption. You can't see Switzerland because it's very tiny, but you can see areas where there are particular impacts through those areas. This is the consequent local species loss caused by freshwater and phosphorus. And you can see here there's quite a lot in Spain, Italy, a lot in Egypt, the USA, India, and down the east coast of Africa in particular. So we can actually measure these leakages now, and we need more done. Something I thought was really interesting in this paper was that they looked at where the actual agriculture was happening and where the impact is happening. So on the food production itself, 64% of that food production was actually happening in Switzerland, quite impressive given the size, and only 36% overseas. But if you look at biodiversity loss, 94% of that was overseas and 40% was in developing countries. So there is our problem, nicely put out. Okay, so the UK has been a leader in international biodiversity policy. I think it's really fair to say that. Just like most other countries, we have our biodiversity strategy and action plan, see there on the left, but we've also led particularly on biodiversity finance. So at COP16, for example, last year, we were very instrumental in launching the Cali Fund, which is a really novel way of bringing pharmaceutical companies, enabling them to contribute to a fund for nature restoration based upon their use of biodiversity for pharmaceuticals. We've also led on things like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Large amounts of overseas development aid is channeled to biodiversity, for example, through the Biodiversity Challenge Funds, the Darwin Initiative. And also recently, we've helped to support the NBSAP Accelerator Partnership, which builds capacity in countries that would otherwise have issues in fulfilling their NBSAPs. So all good stuff. But one of the biggest pieces of leadership that I think we displayed was the Treasury commissioning a very eminent economist, Partha Dasgupta, to produce a review of the economics and biodiversity. And I've just put up here his top messages. And I think a couple of them are really, really important. So the solution starts with understanding and accepting that our economies are embedded within nature and not external to it. At the heart of the problem lies deep-rooted, widespread institutional failure. It's pretty hard-hitting. So that was great. I mean, not great, but, good that they asked. Post-Brexit, we've had a lot of policy, a lot of important policy for nature. We had the Fisheries Act, we had the Agriculture Act, neither of which I'm going to go into because you really don't want to sit here till tea time. But we also had, importantly, the Agriculture Act, which is the thing that the Environment Act that embodies a lot of our nature-related legislation now. Some key elements are some environmental targets, including for biodiversity, environmental improvement plans, the Environmental Principles Policy Statement, and the Office for Environmental Protection. I'm going to quickly whip through all of those. And then also some kind of very specific policies that came after that: biodiversity net gain, environmental land management schemes, too big, won't talk about that, and local nature recovery strategies. So we've got some key biodiversity targets. There's one about species extinction, that's 2042, not 2030 as in the international, but pretty good still and pretty ambitious. And restore creating large amounts of habitat. And then the thing that's closest to the halt and decline lodestar that I mentioned is this species-based one around halting the decline of abundance of species by 2030 and reversing it by 2042. Again, not as ambitious as internationally, but still super ambitious. The Office for Environmental Protection is there to report upon progress being made towards our environmental, the fulfilling of the targets in the Environment Act. Handily, they did an assessment of how we're doing against the Environmental Improvement Programme, which is a kind of more detailed supplementary set of targets that will lead into the biodiversity targets. And so in January, they put their first report out about the EIP for 2023, looking at 5 years of trends. Now, not surprisingly, the overall picture is of not much trend up or down. And that's really not surprising because nature takes a long time to kind of feed through. So any changes that are made, it's going to take a while for that to be recognised in nature. So yeah, not surprising really that the trends are still fairly unexceptional. More worryingly, if you look at all these targets, which this is the assessment of the extent to which, if you look forward to the end point, 2042 or whenever it is, are they likely to be met? And that is a pretty dire picture, I would say, that there's a lot of red of largely off track. So we've set ourselves challenging targets. They are challenging, and we're needing to step up. The Environmental Principles Policy Statement is perhaps the most important bit in the Environment Act for nature because it's the one about mainstreaming. And what it says is that the ministers in all departments must have due regard to these principles in almost all policy making. There's a couple of exceptions. And these are really well-established, important principles. So integrating of environmental protection into all policy making, prevention of environmental harm rather than compensation, rectification of environmental harm at source, polluter pays, and we take a proportionary principle for nature. So all solid, important. Handily again, the Office for Environmental Protection has recently released a first cut at the extent to which these are being integrated into decision making. And they say that, in several departments there are some positive early signs that they're trying to adopt them. There's a lack of policy coherence, though, between the policies in different departments and the environmental improvement principles that have been signed up to by DEFRA, and the departments were asking for further guidance. And in particular respect to today's topics, the recommendation 4 was to update the Treasury's Green Book, which Joseph will be talking about next. DEFRA and the Treasury should uphold their commitments to include reference to the environmental principles policy statements in updates to the Green Book, and this should be done as soon as possible. So that's the recommendation. Right, so now I'm going to pop into a few of the more detailed analyses. And first, biodiversity net gain. So that is a big thing that came in February 2024 after piloting in several local authorities before that. And the thing that is first important to say is that it is based upon the mitigation hierarchy. So first you avoid impact, then you minimise impact, so that's preventative measures, after which you remediate on site, and then if there's nothing else that you can do, once you've done the best you can, then you offset your residual harm, and that's compensatory actions. So that's the basis of all of this. Now, if we're going to get to economic prosperity and the growth of our national prosperity and well-being and nature recovery, we have to offset. We have to take a net approach, whether we like it or not. So there has to be some loss of biodiversity and there has to be some gain, even after we've done all the avoidance. Now, biodiversity offsetting is very controversial, people dislike it. And they dislike it both because they don't like the idea of losing nature and then compensating it, but also they don't like the idea of trading one bit of nature off against another, and then one bit of nature off against other priorities. But it's something we have to do. Now, just to say, that does not mean we need to greenwash. And this is a purely self-indulgent slide because I think it's funny. You might or might not think it's funny. But this is not what offsets should be. So what's the evidence so far that offset programs can achieve no net loss or net gain from around the world? This is a nice piece of work led by Sofasa Ermgas, and looking at the evidence around the world. The evidence is pretty sketchy. There aren't that many assessments, and the actual evidence is very mixed. But I would say that this says that it's not impossible to offset in a way that leads to no net loss or net gain. And in particular, the US wetland banking mitigation actions, which have been going since the 1970s, have had pretty good success in actually creating more biodiversity than was lost. So how did DEFRA actually do this weighing up of gains and losses? Well, they've developed something called the biodiversity metric. We're on issue 4 now, and that helps you to calculate the required compensation when you have damaged nature through a development. And that compensation can be actioned either on-site, i.e. in the area where you're actually doing the development, or off-site. Here's a very quick explanation of what it is. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the biodiversity units lost and the biodiversity units gained are in the same unit, which is important, which is a unit that is size of the area, distinctiveness of the biodiversity, the condition of the biodiversity, the national significance of the biodiversity, and in the post-development phase, the feasibility of actually having this biodiversity happen. So this is a figure from a paper led by Nat Duffus. This biodiversity metric is really quite world-leading in as much as there are very few ways in which people calculate units of biodiversity in one consistent way. And it's been very much of interest to the world. And here's some countries where they've been interested to adopt either the same or a modified version of the BNG calculator. And this is a picture here of me and David Cooper with Minister Huang from China, who came last month to Oxford to find out about BNG, the biodiversity metric, and whether it's something that China could implement. So it's a pretty exciting thing that we've done in this country for all its flaws. So how's the rollout gone so far? This is another paper led by Nat Duffus, just looking at 16 months of actual implementation, so the real data of what's been happening on the ground. So the first thing is what's been converted from what to what, and the vast majority of the off-site offsets, so the offsets that are not in the development area, have been arable land to other neutral grassland. So that's what we've been getting. Another really important thing to note is that the market is not functioning, the off-site market. So many people are putting together areas where they can sell nature gain to people who want it, developers. So the orange is all the different types, it doesn't really matter, but what really matters is that large amounts of nature is available to buy, and only 2% of the ones that have been registered available have been sold so far. So that means we've got massive supply, very little demand. And those people who are purchasing it are the ones who have very small developments, who do not have the space on site to have nature. Everybody else is doing it on site, and that is not going well. So this is a paper by Chapman et al., in which they actually went to 42 areas in 5 local planning authorities to look to see what had actually happened and the extent to which it was what was promised. And the answer is not really very much. And that is because of lack of capacity of local planning authorities to actually do the compliance, and lack of accountability on site because there are no registers of on-site biodiversity net gain, so you can't check it up. So we've got this really vibrant market of people selling biodiversity and people selling advice about biodiversity, and yet it's not being fulfilled. So the next question might be, where do we actually put our offsets? And this is some work led by Mattia Mancini from Ian's lab. just showing that at a national level, where you would put biodiversity offsets really depends upon what you want out of them. So if you want to have local nature in the places where the developments happen, that's the one with the black line. The one with the black line. So that is where the developments are planned to be, and obviously it's around the big cities. So that's where you would get your nature. Whereas if you want to maximise biodiversity bang for buck, then you would go to the areas where there's lots of biodiversity, which is further towards the uplands. That's the green one. And the others are various other configurations. So it really depends. Here's a paper led by Tom Atkins, in which we're doing the same thing, but at the very, very local level. So the red line that you can see is a large housing development just outside Oxford, and we've just looked at 3 different ways to configure the off-site biodiversity gain that you would need in order to get to 10% biodiversity net gain. So if you want to maximise the amenity value to local residents with the same amount of biodiversity, you put your net gain near the deprived areas, near the existing housing estates, so that people can still walk their dogs and still go and get green space after they've lost the land which they currently have. However, if you want to maximise the bang for buck for biodiversity beyond the net gain, then you put it in places that are within the local nature recovery areas, which is the blue, and you put it in very strategic places where you can connect to nature reserves or expand a nature reserve, and you need much less land for the same amount of biodiversity. Or you can do something that is more what the developer wants, and in this case there was a site of special scientific interest nearby, hashed green, which they wanted to divert people from, so they had land that they already owned, so it was nice and cheap, and buffered people from the SSI. So again, another kind of way of looking at this. So I mentioned local nature recovery strategies, and these are things where you kind of look at where's the best place to put biodiversity strategically for connectivity and for the best biodiversity bang for buck. And this is a nice one for Oxfordshire, done by Bob Smith and Prue Addison from BBOUT, and it's using something called Marksan. And Marksan has been going since 2000, so this is something that the conservation community knows well how to do. And it looks at where you could have best representativeness, and this is the thing for the BBOUT catchment. DEFRA is now starting to do this on a national scale, so this is for England. Currently out for consultation is the land use framework, and this just shows where's best for nature in terms of habitat, that's the purple, where's best for food production, that's the light green, and where both would be good, and therefore you may have some decisions to make, perhaps, is the dark green. So this is out for consultation. It's a great step forward. About time. This has been being done in places like Australia and South Africa for a decade or more. I was quite interested in this. This is the modelled outcomes for land, agricultural land, if you met our 2050 environment and climate targets. So it's going from intensive food, orange, all the way to kind of greeny is intensive climate and nature. And you can see the present day for food producing, that's the top set, which is east of England, and mixed land use, which is kind of southwest West England. And you can see it's going from quite a lot of food to quite a lot of nature. What springs out to me, I don't know about you, is how actually it's not that different. Actually, a lot of the land can stay how it is, and then on the margins we can change things. Speeding on, some lessons then from what we've found out so far. I think we really need this strategic approach to nature recovery and land use planning in general, which is now the direction of travel that we're taking, which is great. We need that. We need also to consider people's relationships to their local nature and to stick with the mitigation hierarchy, because we have to avoid impact where we can, because once you've lost nature, you can't bring it back so easily. However, we do have this innovative nature market, which has potential, but it needs support to flourish. And that support mostly needs to come from investment in our planning system. We need to be able to invest in our local planning authorities. We need to be able to invest in research to continue to understand the outcomes from biodiversity net gain over longer periods, the 30 years for which it's supposed to be there, and investment in open and transparent data so that people know what's going on. I didn't want to end with a kind of didactic or any low note. I want to end with some positivity. And this is slightly biased because this is the University of Oxford. We've got a nice big planning system, that's planning application that's just been approved, going through for something called the Bedbrook Science Park. And it's really, really trying to make that difficult nature plus a development thing real. So it's going to be 1,800 houses, of which a large proportion, probably the majority, will be social housing, particularly for low-paid workers at the university. It's got a school, it's got an allotment, it's got a farm, it's got a nature area, it's got a canal-side park, it's got all sorts of lovely stuff, and, you know, really, really trying to meet that biodiversity, net gain, and housing needs. So it's really good. It's sitting currently in some rather dull agricultural land. And if you look at what the architect, I know architects always give you the very rosy picture, but it looks lovely. I'd live there. You know, you've got these beautiful places with lots of greenery. There's no cars on site. And, yeah, so I think it can be done. We need a bit of an imagination. We need a bit of innovation. And now is the time to start thinking about both. Thank you. So I'm not going to take questions, and I'm just going to hand straight over to Joseph because we've got some really cool stuff coming now. So.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, EJ. Some people here will know me, most won't. Who, he, what's he doing here? For 19 years, I had the privilege and the rather awesome responsibility of looking after the Treasury's Green Book. You've probably heard a lot about the Green Book. This is what the last physical copy of the Green Book actually looked like. There have been further iterations of it since then, but it's entirely available online now. In fact, it's publicly available. It always has been. Why it's such a mystery to people and has such a mysterious sort of ogreish image is entirely because people never bothered to look for it or actually to read it. I'm sad to say not enough of them follow it either. But many people say that they do. Now, this was something I did after a 33-year career in business, including a large chunk of it dealing with infrastructure and engineering and stuff like that. And it taught me a lot. It was the most worthwhile and interesting job I had ever done until the last year when I've had the privilege of working with my nice colleagues in Oxford on these very important environmental issues, which is something that began way back. I think it must have been in 2021 when the Dasgupta team was still working on their review, and some of us in the Treasury and in DEFRA realised that we're going to have to respond to this review. We better do something and start thinking about it now. And we managed to get together with a very nice team of specialists across government and subject matter experts and academic experts in Exeter and in Oxford and elsewhere. So what am I going to talk about? Well, what the Green Book does, what its role is, and the way that decisions kind of work in government. I don't mean the everyday decisions, but the big ones. We're going to do something new. We're going to make a big change or make a big change in some way. So everything you've ever been told about the Green Book in the press is wrong. It's junk. You know, the Treasury's going to rip up its rule book. It's a big ogreish thing. It's responsible for every big policy mistake you've ever made and for every vacuum where there should be a strategy or a political objective. Absolute nonsense. It's absolute hype. So what is the Green Book? Well, it's about much more than cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis. Two very nice tools that economists particularly like. They're like a surgeon's scalpel. They're a sharp instrument. The thing is, if you put nonsense in, you're going to get nonsense out. It's as simple as that. And there's a lot more to the Green Book than just CBA and CEA, as we like to call it in-house speak, cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis. It's about how to design things well when you want to achieve an objective. In fact, it's guidance for public officials at all levels on how to think through the provision of advice to elected ministers or to people who've been appointed by ministers and they have the power of decision, because the public sector is awash with arm's length bodies and quangos and things like that, where people have been appointed and been given a limited area of responsibility, and they have to make decisions within certain guidelines and policy guidelines. And they have to be advised as well. So it's guidance for public officials. It's in plain English. Believe it or not, it runs to only 70 pages. But the book is a bit thicker than that because it's got another 50 to 60 pages of technical annexes. But it's written in very ordinary English. Anybody with O-level English and a decent brain can read the Green Book and understand it. And I think more people should. I would say that, wouldn't I? So what can I tell you about the way decisions are made? Well, broadly speaking, there's three kind of big changes that you might want to advise decision makers on. The first one is what action is really required, what's important, how important is it relative to other big things you want to do. And that's not really covered by the Green Book. There are tools in the Green Book that can be used and often are used in that analysis, but that includes all kinds of what we call macro, big economic stuff, and other things too, because this kind of study and the Green Book itself don't just rely on economics. They rely on all the social sciences, all the physical sciences, tricky things like operations research, which occurred during World War II. Operations research was when the government of the day got scientists, mathematicians, people from all areas together and said, we've got this problem, sort it out for us. And the Green Book takes what it needs from all those areas as informed by them. So the economics of climate change, the Stern Review, way back in 2007. The recent Desgupta Review. Those things use economic ideas and so on, and they lay the foundation for direction of travel if government buys into them. And government did buy in to these things, as EJ has just said, in various acts. And I can tell you the Treasury wrote an official response to the requirements of the Desgupta Review, and it said that it would put some general values for nature and biodiversity into the Green Book. I know that for sure because I drafted that bit, and it got through the process of approval by my seniors, and it's there in black and white. There's a commitment to do this. So the second thing, this is what the Green Book actually does do. We look at what is the most socially efficient way of meeting over time, not just tomorrow, but going forward over time, what is the most socially efficient way of achieving a government objective. So we're not telling ministers what their objective should be or what their strategy should be. Number one can help them to know what their strategy is about and how it might be structured. And yes, officials can give advice on that. The Green Book doesn't tell them how to do it. It's got some tools in that if they're wise, they will use, and sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. The Green Book is about number 2, and sometimes it's about number 3, because all governments want to do lots of things because we as citizens want them and need them to do lots of things, and very often there are more things they want to do than they can do all at once. Restriction of resources, restriction of time, and so we need to know the relative importance, the relative urgency, and the interrelationship between those things to manage a complete portfolio of things we want to achieve. Well, the answers that you need to order and structure and prioritise your portfolio are given to you by understanding number 1 and number 2. And that's what the Green Book recommends. So it does have something to say, very briefly, about how to deal with number 3, but it's mostly about number 2. So what else is in the Green Book? Well, it's how to prepare what you need, how to design possible solutions to achieve an objective. And it's not about buying stuff, although it ends up informing how to buy stuff, because we're not here as the public asset owners when we're working in government. We're here as the public service. We don't build hospitals for a lark or to get a few extra votes in our constituency. We build hospitals actually to provide health services. You build a bridge to get people across a gap. And if you build it where nobody wants to get across the gap, eventually a town might build up, I suppose, but it's not really what you do. So it's about service provision. It helps people, no matter what politicians might say, because it's much more sexy to say, I'm going to build you a big, new, shiny, whatever it is, than it is to say, I'm going to give you a better service. Although, thankfully, we are moving to that sort of language. And it doesn't do it on its own. There's a whole family of products, two of which, one is how to produce a program business case, and the other is how to produce a project business case. Programs are for really big things. Say you want to build something like the Elizabeth line, that would be, at the very least, a program. It's got lots of bits to it. You don't just conjure a big thing like a new railway out of the thin air. And within it, it will have lots of projects that deal with the specific components that you need to assemble to build that railway. And the program is about managing, identifying the projects you need, managing them, and bringing the whole railway into being and running it, whereas the projects are about delivering the components to the specification required by the program. Now, it's at program level where we really need to make a big impact. And it's at program level, actually, where most of the social value is created. I keep talking about social value. What the hell is this man talking about, you may think? I don't know. Some of you won't. For those who are not used to thinking about this, the truth is market values don't capture everything, for the simple reasons that they can't. There are some things that we don't buy and sell, either because we can't or because we don't think it's ethical to do so, or we think it's better to provide them in another way. And by and large, that is what the public sector sets out to deal with. Those things that the market either cannot do or cannot do alone or doesn't do as well as if we do them all together. And these publications, the Green Book has an excellent summary of everything in it, but those other two things have hand-holding, step by step by step, of how to think things through. And that is what people are supposed to use to design advice for ministers. And what they involve is a structured consultation process that brings together experts, stakeholders, users in an area where we have a proposal, an objective to fulfill. And it does this based on methods taken from decision theory and all the other sciences that are relevant. So it's not getting people together, what do you think, lads and lasses? It's actually taking them through a structured process, working together, so that you can prepare a small number of suggestions which are not nonsense, which are worth testing with cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analysis. This takes a little time, but not very much, if you actually follow the guidance, get the training, and do it. But there's so much pressure on people to do things quickly, it's often not done as well as it might be, or sometimes not at all. When that happens, you usually get another public sector regrettable debacle. Now, I'm not speaking here on behalf of the Treasury, right? I left a year ago. I can say that now. Right? When you see a really big failure, some major, major program or project, there's two things to understand. Big things are hard to do, right? And when they go well, you never hear about them. When Eurostar moved from Waterloo to St Pancras overnight, it was absolutely seamless. Nobody noticed. Even the people who are going to go on the trains knew because they'd been informed well in advance. On the other hand, when Terminal 5 opened at Heathrow and the baggage handling system went wrong, it was a debacle that rolled on for months. BA were furious because it was their terminal, and it caused a heck of a problem operationally and in the press, and many, many millions of pounds, right, just to sort it out. So things can go wrong even in the private sector. But very often it's because they didn't follow the maxim of 2/3 or 3/4 planning and 1/3 or 1/4 implementation, which delivers success because people are just so keen to get spades in the ground, they dig the wrong thing in the wrong place and it's all goes to hell in a handbasket. So, moving forward, it's about designing programs and projects that can be thought of as either about doing one big thing. I just give this as an example. I mean, it's a climate change example. You might want to decarbonise transportation. Actually, that's a huge, possibly portfolio rather than the programme, but there's lots of things you want to do for that. If you were just combining it to electric vehicles, it's not only encouraging the production of efficient and usable and decent electric vehicles and the switch over to them, you've got to consider, well, are we making enough electricity to run these vehicles, or enough hydrogen if they're hydrogen powered, however you want to do it, and can we distribute that, and have we got the infrastructure, and what is the safety implication? Well, if that you can make a nature view into that, and that's about a really big thing, and you can say, okay, we can really concentrate on nature. What about all the things that are not like that? They're about delivering better health, delivering defence services, delivering welfare services, a whole range of things that the public sector does. Many, many hundreds of millions, in fact billions of pounds are spent by the state every year on doing all those things which superficially don't appear to involve nature. But they do, and they do affect it. This is why we need a general valuation for what we're calling nature, biodiversity, loss of species, reduction in species abundance, and so on. We need a general value for that, in the same way as we have a general value for what we've come to call carbon, but it's greenhouse gases. So, in fact, it's not just the big things that will be about nature, it's for everything, which is why we need a value. So the Green Book already includes the concept of natural capital. In fact, the UK was a world leader in bringing natural capital in. But having it at the conceptual level and having the ONS work on measurement and all that sort of thing is a good thing, it's a start, but that doesn't make the change. The Green Book was the first government guidance in the world to include values and a methodology to account for greenhouse gas emissions. That's a really good first. The challenge now is to get into the Green Book a general value for nature loss, for species loss, for biodiversity. And biodiversity is a much trickier concept to deal with than carbon values. Carbon values are what people in the trade call fungible. Really, a carbon, a ton of carbon emitted in Beijing is as harmful to the planet as a ton of carbon emitted in Edinburgh. Makes no difference. And a saving in Edinburgh is as valuable as a saving in Singapore. And you can exchange it. Biodiversity is not like that, as I think EJ's presentation will have demonstrated. So we need to go further than that. But much of that is not to do with the Green Book. It's to do with wider things. I was surprised last year when I was lucky enough to attend a series of 3 lectures put on, well, no, there were seminars, not lectures, up at the Lord Mayor's Hall up in the city on the subject of nature and accounting for nature in business. And there was a very sensible, rational person from a major institution in the city who was their sort of social responsibility person. And he said, look, you need to understand that there are many people who invest, who really want to account for nature, but they have to place their investments according to the rules. They can't just do it because they want to. and there are many things that they would like to do that they can't just do, either because it doesn't conform to those rules, or because if they do, their company will lose out in the short term. And if a company doesn't survive in the short term, it never reaches the medium and the long term. And he said, looking at the room, you must understand that the market is an amoral mechanism. Well, that's something that anyone who's done A-level economics and has half a brain understands. But it's not something that's rammed into everyone's head throughout education. That being the case, then, government needs to support the market, sometimes set out some rules so they can have a level playing field and they can do what they might otherwise want to do anyway, but are held back because they don't want to lose out in a competitive scramble. But the Green Book doesn't cover that. That's another issue for government. What the Green Book covers is having a general value. So the work that the people in Exeter, and Ben and Ian are going to talk to you about that now, and that we've been considering with colleagues at Oxford and with subject specialists in DEFRA and across the public sector, is about getting this value into the Green Book and giving people something they can actually use when preparing advice for ministers. But there's much more to do than that. So, thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to EJ for organising the event. Thank you to Anusha for bringing us here and having an amazing team to sort all of the technical side out. I'm very happy to be here. So what this session is about for the next 40 minutes is about solutions, right? We want to bring together some of the discussion that there's been about the value of biodiversity and talk about, put some flesh on the idea of embeddedness that is one of the concepts from the Dasgupta review. And then I'm just a warm-up act for Ian, who's going to tell you basically how we're going to solve these problems in the Green Book. Okay, so I wanted to start out by thinking about environment, biodiversity and economic growth. I don't know about you, but I got fairly concerned about the narrative that has come out recently that economic growth and environmental regulation are pitted against one another, and the only way that we get economic growth is by reducing environmental regulations. So I wanted to give you a couple of studies here which I think try to dispel this rumor. Of course, we have to be smart about regulation, but this principle that these two things are pitted against one another, I think, is wrong. So I wanted to start with the bats, and they've much maligned these days. I thought it was very sad that they were blamed for HS2 and such like. But let me tell you this story about bats. This is a series of studies that came after the Dasgupta review, looking at these complex connections between human well-being, economic growth, and biodiversity. Okay. So here's a bat. It has a white nose. This is the white nose syndrome. It turns out that this disease spread in kind of random ways across the east of the USA and the Midwest and caused all sorts of problems. Bats, as you see, they eat more or less 50% of their body weight in insects every day. So they provide this ecosystem service to farmers. And they're part of the ecosystem. They're part of an agricultural system because of this. And it turns out they're part of a determinants of human health, this study showed. So what happened was the bats died, the insects increased, farmers basically increased their inputs of pesticides, insecticides, and so forth. That cost them money, right? And the increase in these pesticides fed through into the water, and that caused problems for human health. Increases in infant mortality, even in the US, a developed, rich country, right? What were the magnitudes of these effects? So in agriculture, losses of $27 billion. That was 12% of the GDP in that particular region which was affected by this outbreak. Infant health, loss of $10 billion per annum. And then recent work by my colleague Eli Fenichel in the US, he was an economist with the White House under the Biden administration, shows that this phenomenon, the impact on agricultural productivity, affected the price at which municipal governments could raise debt, right? So the cost of municipal borrowing increased because of this loss of a sort of keystone species. Isn't that fascinating? So you've got three different things here, right? One production side, one well-being, welfare side story here, and a financial implication of a loss of species, right? So, really interesting. Here's another example. Perhaps if you haven't heard of the first one, you've probably heard of this one. This is the vultures in India. It turns out that, again, complex story. A patent was expired for diclofenac. It's a painkiller that farmers in India give to cattle to improve their productivity, right? Milk production. But this was highly toxic to vultures. So when vultures came and cleaned up the carcasses of dead cows here and there, they all died. I mean, literally, like 80% of them died. You can see the counts falling down. Two pathways for adverse outcomes on public health here. One, through infectious diseases, rats and dogs took over that ecosystem service. Second one, livestock carrion left around. The dogs and the rats don't do as good a job as vultures at cleaning stuff up, right? So that led into water pollution and public health. Again, huge public health problem. 0.48 per thousand increase in mortality, 104,000 deaths. If you want to do the brutal calculus of the value of statistical life here, then this is a loss of nearly $70 billion per annum as a consequence of this loss of a keystone species. Now, what do we learn from this? We learn that we're not valuing lives here. What this tells you is that if you want to reduce the risk of death in a particular country, then ecosystem services may well be a very productive way of doing that, okay? So we have these complex relationships with biodiversity. We're not, our economic well-being, our economic growth, the investment from municipal borrowing, etc., which determines growth as well, by the way, is dependent upon these complex relationships. So when we start thinking about removing regulation on environment, we ought to bear this in mind. It happens in surprising ways, and we don't have all of the information, and in fact, these are just beautiful vignettes which should alert us to the possibilities. So, sort of concluding in a way, we can think about the problem here as, the absence of biodiversity in our decision-making frameworks. And, a key thing here, of course, is that things like pesticides appear in GDP, but the bats don't, right? That asset value of bats does not appear on the balance sheet for a country. So that's problematic, and this is why, as many of us have already said, that the idea of natural capital accounting and thinking about in a natural capital perspective is so important. That's the whole purpose of doing that, is to capture these values, right, in decision making. And then growth and, let's call it value, they're related in other ways which you wouldn't expect, particularly relevant for the Green Book when we're making decisions today which may have implications for the long-term future. So if we think we are going to grow as an economy, then the values that we place on biodiversity and ecosystem services in the future are going to be much larger. Essentially, there's an environmental inflation that ought to be taken into account. This paper in Science, which I was a part of, makes this particular point and has a clear policy prescription. We should have increasing values for ecosystem services when we're doing our cost-benefit appraisal over time, right? We already do this for the value of time saved, so that would have been a major input into the HS2 cost-benefit analysis, by the way. We already do this for public health and values as well. But in ecosystem services are being left behind in the Green Book by not doing this, okay? So the point here is not that we should value necessarily everything in this with a willingness to pay kind of framing at all. The point is that we need to think about what the future is going to be like when we make decisions today, and it's going to be quite different to today. Okay, so growth and environment, it's complex. There's complementarity between environment and biodiversity and our well-being and growth and finance and so on, right? And I think we've shown this in kind of concrete ways, whereas before we were just saying this to ourselves. There is an increasing amount of evidence to show this. If I was to give this presentation next year, I would probably be able to give you a very solid empirical study looking at the effect of biodiversity conservation on reducing zoonotic diseases, right, and preventing catastrophes like the COVID-19 story. That data and those studies aren't in yet, but that's the kind of thing that we could think about. So the key thing, these values are typically missing from the day-to-day decision-making that we make. What we need to do now is bring these values into public decision-making in some way, and that, through the vehicle of the Green Book, I guess, is what Ian is going to talk to us about right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, you can hear me all right? Great. I find it very difficult to actually stay still, I'm afraid. So, talking about bringing nature into public decision-making, and in particular, the Green Book, which Joseph has so eloquently introduced. So this is the official guidelines for appraising government spending in the UK. It actually has international recognition as the leader in the field of such guidelines. Now, as Joseph said, it does very, very much more than just cost-benefit analysis, but I'm afraid I am going to focus on that element of it. Because it does exert enormous influence upon the decisions that actually get passed or not. I'm going to boil down that admirably concise guidance into just 2 bullet points. And it says that we should assess all the benefits and costs of a policy option. What an obvious thing to do, and yet something that very rarely actually happens. The second point is that we should consider all of the options for delivery of the policy outcome and choose those that give the best outcome to society. Now, focus a lot about that on that first bullet point. We have a huge array of evidence on the value of benefits and costs, but you might be surprised that there are 2 areas where, in terms of the value, as opposed to, say, a market price or something, the value, there's actually quite a paucity of robust evidence on value. And one is on the benefits of avoiding climate change, which I'll talk about for in a sec. 2 is the benefits of avoiding biodiversity loss. And this one in particular does, I feel, result in biodiversity being seen as almost a bit of a second-class citizen in appraisals, very ad hoc methods being used, not really any consistency across those decisions. We have come up with a route for addressing this. So climate change, and particular removal of greenhouse gases, is considered in every official appraisal. So how have we done that, and to what extent can the approach taken to incorporating climate change provide us with a route for incorporating biodiversity loss in decisions? Climate change is incredibly complex. It will generate a huge diversity of impacts, not just here, but around the world, and those will come back to affect us yet again. So just actually working out what will be the physical change is really difficult, but actually it's massively then further complicated by the fact that the real impacts depend on what we do. And unfortunately, we don't know what we're going to do between now and whenever the end of any appraisal is. And that uncertainty has only increased over the last year. And I don't think I need to say any more about the origins of that uncertainty. But certainly Trump's got quite a role in that. So we don't know, we can't actually answer the question, what's the value of avoiding climate change? Because we don't know what it's going to be. But that doesn't mean that we ignore it. We actually take a very pragmatic approach to do that, which works extremely well. And it works because the government has set a target in respect of climate change. It said we are going to hit net zero in 2050. And that target is absolutely essential for incorporation in decision making. Now, I will just say, if we falter in that target, or, God forbid, actually get rid of it, then the costs will be enormous into the future. They will just be unknown until they actually happen. But once we've got a target, we can then work out the costs of hitting that target. Bit of complexity here is that there is many ways to reduce the amount of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. And some of them are very effective. They take a lot of carbon out. Some of them only take a small amount. Some of them are very cheap. Some of them are very expensive. And of course, what you want to look for is that perfect case where you've got something that's effective and cheap. It's got high cost effectiveness. And you can take all those approaches, those technologies, and you can rank them according to their cost effectiveness. And basically, here we're looking at the cost of abating a tonne of carbon, and these analysts have then set these up in terms of going from the highest cost effectiveness to the lowest cost effectiveness, the most expensive. It's a bit of a weird diagram because what they've actually done is added in some extra benefits, so you get something really weird, which is negative costs. These are so good in terms of other benefits that they generate that the cost of removing a tonne is considered actually negative. For example, insulating people's homes helps with their health, reduces cost to the NHS. Ought to consider that, and you end up with this unusual concept of negative cost. But you can see it's ranked in terms of decreasing cost effectiveness as you go across there. So you want to start with these things, and then if you need to abate more and more carbon, you need to move into these. Now, we need that target. Oh, sorry, that's just a curve. Just linking it will come in useful in just a sec. We need a target. And let's suppose that the target per annum that will give us net zero by 2050 is around here. Okay, I must admit I'm not actually sure that that is the case, but it is somewhere around here. Okay, that target is assessed, and now we can work out a cost, or a price if you like, that will ensure that all these technologies get activated and that we actually hit the amount of net zero carbon abatement that we need. Okay? Obviously, we still want to start off with these first because they're even better than that particular price, but that is a price that will result in us hitting net zero. Now, this approach can be adapted for biodiversity. Biodiversity, just like climate change, is really complex, and it generates a whole range of values, the actual quantification of which is pretty difficult, but you know, things like, for example, the role of biodiversity in providing ecosystem functioning and processes, things like the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. These are enormously valuable. That fails, we all fail. But unfortunately, and this is the get out for the economists like me, it's not just that the economics is difficult, the science actually isn't there. We don't know. Haven't got perfect information on the relationship between the amount of biodiversity and the amount of ecosystem functioning. We just know that it's essential at some point, and we need to bring it in. Okay? It's all complex to actually value, so what can we do? Well, this is why the HM Treasury Biodiversity Working Group was set up by Joseph, who deserves all the credit for doing that, to actually look at a cost-based approach of delivering biodiversity targets. And here, in essence, it is. So here we've got a very simple graph. It says here, increases in biodiversity. I admit, I'm going to skip what metrics we should use. I'm an economist. I shouldn't be determining that. It should be ecologists determining what the right measure is. But what we can do is say, once you've got that, we can work out the cost of delivering a change in that correct metric. And we, again, have lots of ways of delivering that improvement in biodiversity. Some of them very expensive, some of them cheap, some of them very effective, some of them not very effective. We can rank every single one in terms of their cost effectiveness, the value for money that each one of these gives, because we haven't got infinite money, so we've got to make the best use of it, and we can stack them all up in terms of their cost effectiveness, just like we had with the carbon approach, and just like that, I'm just going to run a line across it just to make it nice and simple. We call this thing the marginal cost of nature restoration. Why do we call that? Well, because economists can't say anything simply. They need to keep themselves employed by using terms nobody understands. But really, it's the unit cost of improving biodiversity. Okay. Just get rid of some of that complication. Now what we need is the ecologists to come in and agree. So I've been in many ecologist meetings, I've rarely seen that happen, but assuming that they can all finally agree, what is the right metric and what's the amount of biodiversity improvement that we need to provide a target for government? Negotiate it with government, and that target actually gets set. And we already have targets in this country, whether or not all the ecologists agree that they're the right ones, but you know, we do have targets. So we can use those targets to now say, well, if we pay enough, we'll get all those technologies activated and get the improvement that we need to, as EJ said, bend that curve on biodiversity loss. We use this to provide us the price. And that's vital because that can now go in to the Green Book. And now we have a perfectly economically consistent way of incorporating not just climate change and carbon, but also nature restoration and biodiversity into the Green Book. I want to give you some empirical examples to just show you can do this, and it also illustrates a very nice difference between carbon and biodiversity. So what we've got here is a measure of cost effectiveness for a technology. The technology is taking land out of livestock and putting it into semi-natural grassland. First thing to note, it's not constant. Why isn't it constant? Well, for two reasons. On the cost side, agriculture is very variable across this country. Some areas, it's going to be very costly to take land out and put it into conservation because it's fabulous land for food production, that sort of stuff. But also on the benefit side of it, the effectiveness, the increase in conservation and biodiversity that you're going to get from taking that piece of land out of livestock and putting it into, in this case, semi-natural grassland to give you the biodiversity that you actually want. So a big difference, and this is, I thought Joseph put it really well. I think he said, you know, a ton of carbon going out into the atmosphere in Beijing and a ton of carbon going out in Edinburgh. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter. The climate doesn't care. Why? Because carbon perfectly mixes in the atmosphere, so it'll have the same effect on climate change. That's not the case with biodiversity. And in calculating that cost effectiveness, we have to take that into account. But that's not the only way of doing it. There might be another approach. Here we are, converting arable farmland into that semi-natural grassland. And as again, what you can see, there's spatial variation in the cost effectiveness, changes in the amount of biodiversity you're going to get per pound. And if we compare across these two technologies, we can see, well, actually, this one's a lot better than that one. Okay? That comparison actually is mainly being driven by the opportunity cost of taking land out of agriculture here. Okay, that's grand. That means we can estimate those cost curves that I talked about before. So here is some empirical ones. So again, we've got the biodiversity gain in the units that the ecologists told us are the right ones to do. And here's the cost per unit of biodiversity gain. And here's a technology converting arable land into woodland. And what we see is it costs a lot of money to get improvements in that, because the arable land's pretty expensive. Woodland's great for carbon. It depends what sort of woodland you've got if you want to look at biodiversity and where it is. So it's, yeah, some of it's good, some of it's not so good. And there you've got a cost curve. But that's not the only way of doing it. As before, here's the livestock into natural grassland, and you can see this curve's moved over here. What does that mean? That means that for any cost, I'm getting more biodiversity. Okay, and we can imagine other technologies. Where it really gets cost effective is when you begin to combine technologies and you use the right approach in the right place, and you now, for the same amount of money, are generating much bigger biodiversity gains. That really matters, because we're never going to live in a situation where biodiversity and conservation budgets are infinite. They're always going to be limited. We need to make sure we're spending that as efficiently as possible if we want the best bang for buck in terms of biodiversity. Right, so you can see that this approach has, I believe, great potential for actually bringing biodiversity into the Green Book, into government regulation on exactly the same basis as carbon. If you think the approach to carbon is okay, you kind of have to think that this is okay. But I want to finish with one other point. And I thought the point that Sir Dave made right at the start was very appropriate with regard to this. I'm going to go back to this first issue. Assess the value of all the benefits and costs of a policy option. So I'm going to illustrate it with something that we were asked to do a few years ago. They said, have a look at the potential for storing carbon from trees, and you know, they said we want you to do it really thoroughly. Look at different species of trees, look at the interaction with soil carbon, that sort of stuff. Look at it over time, look at it over space. And basically you went away, and what we said was, yeah, we'll do all that, but that's just not enough, because that is not the consequence of planting trees in the UK or anywhere. You have to look at the full effects of this, because whether you like it or not, these effects will happen. And yes, biodiversity is one of those effects, but there's so much else as well. And we have to move away from what I would term focused analyses, which sound absolutely great, to analyses which are system-based. They're actually real-world analyses, because these things will happen whether you account for them or not. So, yes, you need to be looking at biodiversity, but you also need to be looking at the fact that if you plant these on an area of land, and I should say I'm massively pro-tree, I think they're about the best thing you can do with a piece of land that is anywhere near wherever you are, but it will have effects on, say, food production. And if you don't take care of it, it will result in changes in imports, and that will result in, for example, carbon emissions or biodiversity losses around the world, water system, that sort of stuff. What we need is decision support, which actually tells someone what the consequences of their different decisions are. And this has to be decision support that's fit for purpose, not only fit, you know, for some hypothetical person that has a PhD in absolutely everything, because there isn't that person anywhere in the world. They have to be tools which, Joseph described that person, an intelligent person who is not an expert in absolutely everything, because none of us are, but can actually understand clear information when given. We have now the ability to do that. So we have the models underpinning. So, you know, you've got all that there. In models world, that relates to that. And this has been done. All of these models have been brought together. They have been integrated. And yes, I'm afraid that AI has helped enormously in doing that. But you still need to go that extra step. You need to work with real-world decision makers, and these are the ones that we've been working with. Yes, from government, but also from the third sector, from local government, and from the private sector as well. Because again, as Dave said, a lot of companies want to find out about this and actually reduce their impact. And actually, all they're waiting for is for government to have the nerve to give a consistent regulatory and policy baseline for all companies to do the same thing. Last slide here, what we've done with that is actually come up with tools where the user can pick from a huge range of the effects that will happen when they change land use. So obviously they need to know about their budget, but what's going to happen to food production? What's going to happen to carbon? What's going to happen to biodiversity, water, that sort of stuff? And this nexus of models will allow you to say, well, here is a solution that will give you the targets that you have set for all this change, and actually tell you what the consequences of those are. And these tools now exist. They already exist across England. We're hopeful that we'll be able to offer them across the whole of Britain soon. Okay, so I hope that leaves you with the impression, which I'm very keen to pass on, that there is a way of bringing biodiversity into standard appraisal rules for not just government spending, but actually spending for any decision maker. Thank you.
Questions. So we've got a bit of time for Ben, Joseph and Ian to answer some questions or any points that people have. Ben and Joseph, do you want to come up?
Thank you. Ian Dickey from Economics for the Environment Consultancy, and thanks for all the excellent presentations and really clear framing of the problems and issues. My key point though is, Ian, your final point that there is a system here to use a cost-based approach. I don't agree with that. I think there's great potential to use it, but while the measurement of biodiversity is still a black box in your system, I'm afraid I don't trust it. For example, because I think a lot of the analysis is of the actions to try and restore biodiversity, not the outcomes for biodiversity. and the spatial scale at which that analysis is done, and the other things will influence the result fundamentally and could be wrong. I'm sorry, I don't trust it.
Ian, do you want to respond?
I'll start and then pass to Ben. I think there's a few issues there. One is this is a pretty new proposal. We need more work on what the cost effectiveness actually is. Don't deny that. The two examples I've given and those 4 graphs, that's us tapped out. That's all we've been able to do on, by the way, 0 money to prove this in principle. Yes, it would be great to see that addressed and a more systematic attempt to work out costs. With regard to the second point, which I think is wrapped up there, that's what is the right metric, okay? And I guess, deliberately said that shouldn't be an economist telling you what the right biodiversity metric is. It needs ecological input. But actually, I think it's a bit more complex even than that. And I'm going to pass over to Ben to talk about that.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Great point, Ian. Thanks for making it. So in a way, we can answer both those questions a little bit here. First, we do have examples which have very specific biodiversity metrics, which we could have shown you, but Ian has pragmatically avoided specifying a particular metric in this case, right? So the metrics we chose were ones that there are actually targets for in the Environment Act. So species richness in the UK context, in the EU context, it's extinction risk. Broadly speaking, we can think about extinction risk as being part of the international commitments and so on and so forth. It's actually specified in the Montreal Kunming agreement, right? So there we have some very specific metrics. It's not a black box. It's these are targets which are written down on paper. And all we're saying is, how do we reach those targets? What's our strategy here, right? And once we have a strategy, that immediately tells us something about the shadow prices we should have in the Green Book, right? It's just implied from the stringency of our policy. Any intervention that we evaluate now either pushes us towards that, meeting that target, is a benefit in a sense, or it pushes us away from that target and enters it in the ledger as a cost. That's the basic idea here. And like in relation to the first question, why are we doing this? Well, you can imagine, like you talked about annoying people. I'm an economist working on biodiversity. I annoy everyone all the time by just mentioning value or prices or whatever, or trade-offs even, you know. That is problematic, and I think that the cost-based approach has some advantages to it because the targets are socially defined in a way. We talk to ecologists, we talk to people like you who work on valuation, and we know from that work that these targets are important to reach because there's a broad willingness to pay for them out there, right? So I see the work that you do as feeding into the stringency of the targets. And by doing that, we're navigating the criticism that we often get in this world as economists, that we're just using willingness to pay measures to value biodiversity or this or that. And willingness to pay is based on income and et cetera, along down that line, you know. So we're trying to kind of circumvent those kind of objections to what we actually need in the Green Book, which is some rational decision making when it comes to nature.
Great, thank you. So we've got 3 people who had their hands up, and we're just going to ask them to say their points. We may or may not have time to answer them. So we've got the lady in the white, and then
That's great.
Same point. Okay. So we've got Joe and Anusha, and then we'll move on.
Hi, I'm Joe Hoddart, Nature Metrics. My question is, how do we, in a world where Nigel Farage could come to power, how do we build resiliency in these targets so that they can't be unravelled by 5-year election cycles?
Okay, and Anusha, quickly to finish.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, when we say carbon is same, whether it's in China or Edinburgh, but carbon you can't see. With nature, you can see things. It's tangible. I think we forget that point. You can, and the health metrics of it. I think I'm slightly whilst I completely get the point that the Green Book has a lot of material in it and we just need a little bit of tweaking and valuing the cost and all, but I would also say, are we looking at, if you look at Das Gupta's biodiversity thing, we're still in a world where, when the tree is there and all the benefits, multiple benefits it gives, we don't value it, but when it's cut, as they say, then you get the value of it. Unfortunately, we live in that world, so we can't soon, ideally, we can't change GDP just straight away, so this interim measure is important. I think what I'm getting at is, should we be looking at something different, like, for example, a doctor doesn't know 100% evidence when they treat a patient, right? And someone rightly said that. Sometimes it's no regret solution. How do we get something in the Green Book for now, for the next few years, so that you have the nature-first approach of natural flood management, and then when the residual risk is there, then you build something which is a flood defense. Because my worry is, unless we all agree to what the cost and the value should be, we lose so much nature. So there has to be some interim radical thing we need to do before we get there.
Okay, no time for anyone to answer, but those are good questions that have been put out there, and we'll have some Q&As near the end as well. So thank you to the three of us.
Thank you.
Okay, now, can I take that? Actually, Ben. Yeah, thank you. So now, excitingly, we've got a panel to finish us off with some really eminent and outstanding people, and I'm very excited to welcome them to the stage. Okay, so we're going to start off with everybody just briefly introducing themselves, just for a minute or two, and we'll start with Rosie and work backwards.
Hello, I'm Rosie Hales. I feel I ought to explain my pedigree is as an academic. I used to be the Director for Biodiversity at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, but a few years ago I moved to the National Trust to be their first Chief Scientist, so I am now the Director for Science and Nature. And I also chair DEFRA's Biodiversity Expert Committee.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. My name's Tom Butterworth. Nice to see so many familiar faces in the audience as well. I am an ecologist. I've worked for a very large number of years on these metrics and the difficult challenges that they bring. I lead our work on nature in ARUP, which, if you're not aware, is a big engineering, architectural and design organisation. And I'm also a director for the UK Business and Biodiversity Forum. So that's me.
Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Sallie Bailey. I'm Chief Scientist for Natural England. I've been in post for about a year now, so I don't think I can say I'm new anymore. Prior to that, I was Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor for Scottish Government, the Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture. And prior to that, I spent a while in another part of the arm's length body infrastructure, I guess, in the public forestry sector. And then way back when, I did at some point used to be a research scientist myself as well, specialising in landscape ecology and biodiversity and natural capital. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, thank you for having me here. My name is Duffus. I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford, and my research looks at the ecological outcomes of biodiversity net gain, or BNG in England, particularly the way that the statutory biodiversity metric works, how it correlates with other biodiversity outcomes, and more recently thinking about the outcomes of the off-site BNG market, what is being delivered, how much demand there is, potential kind of barriers and enablers there. Thank you.
I'm James Richardson. I'm the Chief Analyst at the Climate Change Committee with a statutory advisor to government on climate, and particularly in this context on adaptation as well as on net zero. I also used to be the Deputy Chief Economist at Her Majesty's Treasury, as it then was, His Majesty's Treasury now. Joseph used to work with me. I was responsible for the Green Book for 9 years.
AV guys, I don't think I've got any mic. could have the little thing. Otherwise. Oh, that's better. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then there'll be some time for Q&A after that. So let's start off with, I think we can all agree that nature isn't appropriately valued in public decision making today. And I'd like James start to, as someone perhaps as an outsider to nature, what do you think the fundamental problem is?
It's a really good question. I think there is in my mind, I think there's kind of at least three things going on here. Some of them have been discussed. So there is this kind of measurement problem, right? It's really hard to know what we're talking about in a simple way, and therefore to be able to differentiate what's big from what's small. And I think if you can't do that, you will not get good public policy. And I know it's hard, but measuring the economy is hard. We have GDP. People love to write books about everything that's terrible about it. But actually, it's used by every country in the world. It's been around since the Second World War. It kind of correlates with lots of things you care about. It is literally an apples and pears measure, right? It measures the value of apples and pears and most other things in the economy. If you can put that together and get everyone to agree, you must be able to do something similar on biodiversity. I think carbon measurement is much easier. So you've got to be able to tell big from small. I think the second thing is a lot of the focus is on kind of marginal change, right? It's around the kind of land use change. I want to build some houses, I want to build a piece of infrastructure or whatever. And you're comparing that with what is probably quite a deteriorated piece of nature. So you're not valuing the nature very well, even if you've got a good measure of it, because most of the value's been lost. And then you're saying, well, I want to compare that to something like house building, which is really valuable for the economy. And so you're kind of asking the wrong question. The scales are just tipped the wrong way. There needs to be a kind of strategic approach, as we have with something like a carbon budget, that says, here's all the emissions in the economy. Here are the ones that are really important. So we do talk about, asthma inhalers, but we spend a hell of a lot more time talking about electric vehicles and heat pumps, because that's where you make a big difference. So you've got to kind of think about what the really big impacts are that would bring about the outcomes you want to achieve on nature and focus on them rather than just on kind of things that come up and get business cases and get change. And then the third thing is kind of political salience. Now, I'm not a politician. I find it curious because we know the public actually care about this stuff. And in the greater scale of things, it's not that hard relative to a lot of the problems that governments do face. But it somehow doesn't get the kind of salience, even than we get on climate change. At least on the net zero side. It's quite similar in that way to the adaptation side, where we also struggle to get salience, even though you constantly read articles in the newspaper about the latest disaster. Actually getting it into the political process is hard. So I think those would be the three challenges. It's quite a lot, I realise.
Yeah, and Tom, from the business side, what's your view about why it's so difficult to get nature value up?
Well, I think there's a huge appetite from business, we've already heard about that today, to step forward, to take nature into account and to think about it strategically across the business and for those individual projects that it's working, that any business is working on. However, I think there's a couple of things that perhaps play off some of the things we've just heard that are really quite challenging. One of them, yes, there is a challenge on measuring. Actually, I think we're moving forward on that. I think we've got some real traction on how to develop metrics and the types of metrics that we need for nature. There's a second piece, though, that is around the idea that an awful lot of development, is you go in and you build something and then you walk away. And if we're going to deliver the benefits from green stuff instead of grey stuff, you need to then managing it over the long term. So this means a shift in expenditure from what the business might look at in terms of its capex into its opex, from its existing spend on a development project into managing that over the long term. That is a significant shift in how we look after our estate, whether it be the highways estate, rail, or our housing developments. So those two pieces, that piece is really important. And then to add to that, or to get the clarity to allow us to make that shift, we need long-term, stable, clear requirements. Because if we don't have those, you're not going to get that return. Nature takes a long time to deliver those benefits. We're not going to get that return. We're not going to get the benefit in flood relief. We're not going to get the benefit in human health overnight, it takes time, which means we need stable policies and requirements.
Rosie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I would very much agree with that, but I think that, you know, connecting what the two of you have said, I think part of the reason why we don't get political salience is because it needs long-term solutions, you know, and that quite characteristically, I think, on the whole, policies, you know, the reward, if you're going to go for expenditure that's going to give you quicker reward, that's what you'll do, and you need to really play the long game in terms of nature. But I would also say that I think another kind of really systemic issue is that, you know, everybody here in this room understands the sort of slides that Ian was putting up talking about systems and how everything is actually connected. But I'm not sure that you know, penetrates very far outside of this room. We, you know, our education system, the way we focus on, you know, in degrees and the way our you know, we have siloed thinking, and we're brought up in specific disciplines. And there has been a move towards interdisciplinary thinking, but you know, that's going to take quite a long time to break down, I think, and become more mainstream.
Yeah. So, Nat, I think there's a lot of pressure on ecologists, isn't there, being put on us by economists. You're at the nitty-gritty sharp end of measurement, so what would you like to say back to the economists?
Yeah, feeling the pressure as an ecologist to come up with a metric at the moment. Yeah, I think for me the first part is I think biodiversity is so context and scale dependent that for me, I think searching for a single metric in the way that we've done with climate or with GDP, I think is very, very challenging, if not impossible. So I think we have to be a bit pragmatic about choosing metrics and choosing what to measure. For example, biodiversity net gain, it measures biodiversity, but in actual fact, it measures habitat, extent, and condition. So I think it's about being kind of upfront about what we're actually measuring and what is important in decision making. But I would give a nod to, I think, technology. I think some of the kind of advances in remote sensing, in environmental DNA, in bioacoustics present very promising avenues to detect and measure things that have previously been very challenging to detect and measure, things like soil fauna and vertebrates. So I think that's a promising avenue, but I think realistically, in my view, looking for a single composite indicator of biodiversity is going to be impossible. I think we have to choose the things that kind of reflect what we want to measure in particular circumstances.
Sallie, did you want to add something?
Yes, I can. And I feel your pain, Ian, because if you put ecologists into a room and ask them to come up with one metric or agree on metrics that already exist, they will inevitably develop a new one. And EJ and I were in the States recently at a meeting where we were talking about that, and almost it did exactly that. So I think we need to be aware that, you know, that's the creative space that we all like to work in, and it can become its own industry. So for me, I think we need to coalesce around simple, robust and repeatable measures that can be easily understood, attractable, and will stand the test of time. I am about to contradict myself though. Importantly though, the challenge is about setting a robust baseline as well, and knowing where we are going to go back to in history to enable us to set that baseline. So it's not going to drive us to unachievable goals, but it is going to get us back to functioning and robust and resilient nature. So to draw on that, and this is where I am going to contradict myself, like you've already mentioned the potential for AI and robust and digital solutions to understanding more about biodiversity. There is huge potential for us to develop more and more in that area. and develop more safer ways of measuring, you know, thinking about getting digital to do the stuff that's dirty, dangerous or dull, and using technology in that way. But also then where I'm getting really excited is about getting us to the point for the Global Biodiversity Framework to actually unlock our ability to measure and track improvement to ecosystem recovery as well, and get into that ecosystem health and resilience. We're talking about biodiversity here. I hope that ultimately we're talking about developing back, restoring back nature into healthy and recovered ecosystems, because they're the bit that society is going to depend, that are going to provide the natural capital or ecosystem services, or however you want to describe it. So if we can get our measurements to get us into that space, then we can really track policy impact towards that.
Super, thank you. Now, if you look in the public discourse, I guess there's an awful lot about competing priorities that we have for our land. And that includes things like solar, includes new infrastructure, food security, and of course nature. So Rosie, as a representative of a very large landowner and someone who's kind of intimately involved in that debate, what advice would you have for government in reconciling some of those competing priorities?
Well, actually, you know, I think this government has been, you know, over the years has been quite innovative. We've already heard about the Environment Act. We've heard about, you know, the consultation that's been going on about the land use framework. So that, you know, there's a recognition that we need land to be multifunctional, and I think there is a recognition that we need to make some hard choices over what we do where. And in some ways, the National Trust is a bit of a microcosm of that, in that we are landlords to many tenants. We have about 6 million members and visitors that you know, we're also serving, but we also, as a charity, want to serve society, and we want to maximise the public benefit that we get from our land. And you know, in some ways, we are very fortunate in that the UK is one of the best monitored countries in the world. You know, there's a lot of data. You know, there are government sort of indications of direction of travel, and so you know, the way we're trying to use the kind of land, the tools and metrics that are emerging from research communities to actually look at different scenarios, make choices about what we do where. So you know, in that sense, yeah, we do, but you do also need to be quite brave about it. You need to face into some of these choices.
You know, I think, Nat, you've got some things to say about current prioritisation, haven't you? And
yeah, I think perhaps slightly more on the kind of planning and infrastructure side rather than the kind of land use framework. And yeah, I think the kind of current framing around kind of planning versus nature is quite unhelpful. And I think there are some very good examples where both have benefited. Again, taking the biased example of Bregbroke, kind of very creative design. But yeah, and I think some of the kind of current decision making, I think we need to be evidence-based. So thinking, for example, biodiversity net gain and the proposed exemptions. If our kind of understanding is that biodiversity net gain obligations are delaying small developments, I wouldn't say that the solution I would jump to would be to get rid of it for small developments. It would be to identify what the actual kind of pinch points are, if they are in the dialogue with the local planning authority, or if they are in accessing off-site biodiversity units and addressing those, rather than just deciding to kind of get rid of it for those developments, because yeah, that's not going to benefit nature, and losses won't be compensated for. So yeah, I think the prioritization, I don't think that one has to come at the expense of the other. There are so many examples of where they have worked together and nature and people have benefited.
brilliant, yeah, and that's a really good segue into something I want to ask Tom, because there's a lot of chat about whole of society approaches. It's one of the big buzzwords, and obviously the whole of society includes business. So, you know, how do you feel that business fits into this debate?
Well, I think that firstly, I think it's really important that we talk about that whole society approach whenever we're talking about any infrastructure, any land use change. I think the discussion around is it for food or is it for a road is perhaps a little bit too simple. We need to be much more nuanced than that. Is the food production actually causing problems to our water quality at the moment and releasing carbon? Is the future road the right solution for that transport route? And what's the wider ecosystem within which it sits? We are not going to be able to live in our cities. We're not going to be able to travel and work in a changing climate if we do nothing. Part of the solution to making our cities resilient, making our infrastructure resilient, is thinking about nature. Now, who and what organisations is helping to shape all of that? Well, business is at the very heart of that. Business is at the heart of shaping our infrastructure, developing our cities, creating places we live in, creating the things that we use, our food we eat. And unless we're working together collaboratively to deliver positive outcomes, we won't have a resilient place to live in. Now, the challenge for businesses is that a lot of the assessments that are done, the tree that's cut down, the value of the tree when it's standing is to society. The value to tree when it's cut down, it's to whoever takes that wood away. That is often a business. We need to make sure that we bring these discussions together so that we understand the value to business and society together, and we don't end up with trade-offs with one or the other, because we can find mutual win-wins.
Brilliant. James, you've been about a bit in government. What advice would you give, based on experience for other sectors, to this sector?
So I think it's a combination of different things, some of which come up. I think, as I said earlier, like, you've got to know what's big and small. If you try and fight every single battle and focus on kind of everything, you'll get nothing. So, start by having a kind of shared agreement about what really matters and do that stuff first, and then you can kind of work your way through. But you've got to know what's big and small. I think also some of these questions around kind of complexity are really difficult, because on the one hand, like, if you don't understand the system stuff, there's a high risk of just getting the wrong solution. On the other hand, if you turn up in front of the minister with one of those diagrams where everything's connected to everything and try and explain that, you're also going nowhere, right? Government has a bandwidth challenge. There's a lot of stuff going on. Ministers and decision makers are incredibly busy people, and they cannot kind of absorb all of that complexity. So you have to try and find some way through that. At some level, somebody has to understand that, right? When we do a carbon budget, there's 400 pages of analysis, there's a 500-page methodology document. All of the stuff in that diagram about kind of land use, I think, is in our modelling, right? But when we go and talk to the public, we say, eat less meat, grow more trees, right? You've got to find a way of doing both of those things. And also, you've got to be able to take some of that complexity out of the policy-making process, because it just gums everything up. If you have to think about everything, otherwise the judge is going to send you back to do your homework again, no decision will get taken, and a bunch of people will leap on that to try and stop any decision getting taken, and governments will then get incredibly frustrated and say, we must scrap all these rules, right? That's the logic that is going on there. You've got to find a way in which you can do that analysis without getting judges involved, and without it stopping everything. And sometimes that's about saying, we'll do it now once for everything, and then it's available and everybody else can kind of build on it, so it doesn't get ignored. But if you have to do it every single time, nothing will happen. And again, at some point the system will break when you try and make it work like that. So I would try and cut through that.
That's very sage advice, thank you. Sallie, I know that there's a natural capital approach that Natural England's very much behind. I wonder if you could mention a bit about that.
Well, thank you, because it saves me making a shameless plug at the end as well. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, so I'd encourage people to look at the State of Natural Capital report, Risks to Nature and Why They Matter. It was published at the end of 2024. and is easily Googleable. Other search engines are available, of course. Now, this is also comes out of the Disruptor review. It was another work stream that was taken forward. And what it's doing is it's making the invisible visible to policy, business and finance. So it's broken down effectively our natural capital across England, has done a risk assessment, and then what it's doing is really innovative it's taking that for policy makers that don't necessarily go to nature as their first concern, and telling them why it matters to them, and also businesses, sectors as well. I would encourage you to have a look at it if you haven't looked at it, because the analysis in there is all freely available, as are a lot of mapping products as well, to help all sectors make decisions based on the state of nature as it is now, and then bringing policy in exactly as we've been talking about today, as to those actions that need to happen urgently to enable nature to sustain us and society going forwards.
Thank you. Rosie, Tom mentioned societal benefits and private benefits, and then being very difficult to make commensurate. How do you think we can actually get some effective functioning of some kind of market that will bring in those societal benefits?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, the fundamental problem is, of course, we recognise that we need to get multiple benefits from how we ideally should manage land, and therefore there will be multiple beneficiaries. So the question is, who should pay for that? And if you have one particular interest, I think, one particular beneficiary driving that land management or that land use change, that can lead to suboptimal outcomes. So how do you get that kind of right blend? And I think that needs to be done through the right blend of, considering who the beneficiaries are, and then it's a blend of kind of regulation, possibly levies on businesses, recognition of the public benefit that different public bodies might glean also from that land use change, so that you can get the right set of outcomes. So and we need to do this reasonably rapidly. We can't really wait for these nature markets to kind of gradually evolve and develop. So I think this is a case where we need significant investment up front from government to really kind of accelerate the development of these markets. We need, there's already work going on to ensure consistency and standards, but we need that clear framework, and then I think the investment will follow.
Tom, did you want to add anything?
Well, I was just, what I was struck by is there's a couple of different pieces here that I think link together. There's the evaluation and the understanding, and I think we've got some brilliant work from Natural England and others and the Green Book to help us articulate all of that. That valuation is not the decision. It's really important that that is just a decision-making tool. It's information to inform those decisions. And those decisions need to be made in the context of our legislation that then drives action. And that's where these discussions, actually this afternoon, and I mean a large stakeholder discussion, specifically to try and bring this out and open up some of these types of challenges. This is really important. So that public discord is critical, that discussion is critical. But it's got to be in the context of that clear, consistent and long-term requirements. Because otherwise, we do run, all of us, will run for the thing that's easiest, rather than the thing that's got that long-term benefit for generations.
Super. So I'm going to move now to any kind of input from the floor. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to get a few people to say some things, and then we'll see which of the panellists want to say anything back. So Mark's got his hand up first. Yeah, okay. So Kiana, if you can start there and kind of move along, and we'll just take these four. So Mark, and then the two there at this table here. So Mark there. Yes.
Hello, Mark Dickey-Collis. I'm a natural scientist working for myself. I come from the marine world, very much working in ecosystem-based fisheries management. And you've spoken about valuation, and there was a little discussion about how the ecologists should contribute to this. But then the phrase baselines was brought up by Sallie, and I began to get a bit scared there, because in the marine world, we are losing all our baselines. It's changing so rapidly, everything from the Mediterranean, North Sea, North Atlantic. How do we continue down this road using phrases like baselines?
Okay, brilliant. And I think Caitlin in the blue shirt, woman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Caitlin Hafferty. I work in the School of Geography at the University of Oxford on collaborative and integrated governance for delivering multiple benefits out of land use change. My question is about that as well. If you've mentioned the need for collaborative approaches, bringing together multiple actors, considering power dynamics between beneficiaries, navigating trade-offs and tensions to ensure multiple benefits. And I wanted to ask about that. How can we actually integrate this and make sure it is evidence-led, drawing on the best social science evidence and expertise in this space? So I'm wondering if panels can talk to that collaborative governance approach and multiple benefits.
I think there was someone just at the table in front. Yeah, the woman is there. And then we'll have you, and then we'll have a bit of a round.
Thank you. Helen Wallace from DEFRA's International Biodiversity and Climate Team. So I guess a few thoughts in my mind are kind of around the sort of the context of what we've seen this morning is a very sophisticated approach to understanding biodiversity in this country, but not every country has the same level of sophistication. Another challenge we've heard talked about is the sort of the political dynamics and the need to deliver change on a much kind of shorter time frame than necessarily we would be thinking of. And we have a real opportunity early next year with the UK hosting the next IPBES meeting, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a bit of a mouthful. I guess my question to the panel is, what can this community do to really help, really sort of coalesce and help deliver step change in the short term? And I think this kind of speaks to the points that James was making around kind of there's a lot of complexity here, but how can we find a way through that complexity to make a step forward in the right direction? Thanks.
Brilliant. We'll go with the beard and then we'll stop.
Hi, thank you. I'm Adam Kiani. I work in the mycorrhizal ecology team at Kew Gardens. One of the issues that's been talked a lot about so far is how to capture the biodiversity we know about already into a single metric, and that's obviously very complicated. Another issue, I think, though, which is particularly relevant for our work, is that we don't yet have measures, or we don't have historic records, at least, of large parts of the biodiversity landscape. So, yeah, my question is, how can we balance the innovation of measuring more biodiversity and covering more of that biodiversity landscape with trying to generate indicators to measure progress against these broad biodiversity targets?
Okay, some really excellent questions here. So baselines, collaboration, what can we do for IPBES and particularly, and then how can we monitor biodiversity more effectively? So Sallie and then Nat.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question on baselines, and thank you also for mentioning marine, because marine has been quiet today, and we need to remember what we're talking about today applies equally to the marine and coastal environment. So thanks for raising that. In terms of baselines, absolutely, it's a different, I was going to say kettle of fish, but that's probably the wrong thing to say in this. It's a different set of parameters, of course, in the marine environment, and we need to be much smarter about looking forward to restoring ecological integrity and function rather than back to a historic environment which we don't have. And also we need to be careful about taking that approach in terrestrial systems as well, of course. So I don't have a smart answer for you. In fact, you probably have the answers as well. So I think we need to talk more about how this equates and translates into the marine environment, absolutely.
I also want to touch on the baselines and then also the kind of measuring, how can we measure things that we don't even know about, and I also don't necessarily have a smart answer. It'll be more kind of a series of observations. But I think the baseline challenge is very interesting, but so is the reference site kind of challenge in all of this when designing interventions. I've seen it a lot with biodiversity credits, and even terrestrially in England, for many systems, we don't have very good reference sites, or we have a single reference site that we're all referring to, which is not in the spirit of kind of biodiversity. So I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind when designing metrics and interventions, is what do we know about the baselines and what do we know about the reference sites? And then, of course, also a very interesting point about kind of things that we don't even understand yet. My work has looked a lot at insects and invertebrates, so I'm very kind of passionate about that kind of hidden aspect of diversity. And I think that's why the funding of taxonomy and research into identifying all of this kind of undiscovered diversity is so incredibly important. But in the meantime, I think when designing metrics, it's trying to choose things that have been shown to correlate with other aspects of diversity, to try and catch as many things in that umbrella as possible, even when we don't necessarily know the specifics of what is there. Or also thinking about functional diversity as well as kind of species-specific things.
Rosie?
I wanted to say a little bit about biodiversity metrics, because we don't yet have one metric that we can put on the x-axis of Ian's graph, but we do have quite a lot of knowledge, but we've also got a sense of urgency that we kind of need to get on with it. And I'm very much in this context in the National Trust. If I actually I have to make my case for the fact that we should monitor outcomes and track progress towards our KPIs. But of course, that takes resource away from direct delivery. So I have to be very careful about how those resources are allocated. So quite simply, we want to be able to contribute to the international commitment of 30% of our land and seas being well managed for nature by 2030. That sounds like quite a simple statement. And then the detail comes in as, what do you mean by well managed for nature? And some people have looked at DEFRA's guidelines and they interpret that more towards actions, whereas if you look at the IUCN guidelines, that's very much more focused on outcomes. Now, of course, actions are linked to outcomes, although there's a noise around that relationship. And I think the only what we're proposing to do is to monitor our actions, but also try and capture our outcomes over the next decade, so that we can learn as we go along. And that's essentially trying to be pragmatic. You need to capture the measurements that you can, and also try and capture the evidence that you're achieving the outcomes that you're aiming for. So that's not a single biodiversity metric, but it's our kind of pragmatic way forwards for now.
So I'm going to make 3 points quickly to add on to that, and then to answer the question around the bringing people together and the international point. Metrics, I would... it's challenging, but I think the Nature Positive Initiative and their State of Nature metrics work has taken a massive leap forward in agreeing how we start to measure change. And yes, it's terrestrial largely rather than marine at the moment, and yes, it doesn't capture everything, but it's a really good step forward, and part of what we need to do is get agreement. Actually, that's almost as, not as important, but that's really critical, and they are doing a brilliant job on that. That's not one metric, it's probably a group of 4 or 5, little basket of metrics. That's my first point. The second point on how do we bring everybody together? This might sound like an advert, but actually this is exactly what I do in the consultancy that I work within. We have a whole load of experts, and we bring in others as well to think about how we address the social impacts of a piece of development, or the nature impacts, the water impacts, and so on. And this nature-led lens is actually becoming quite common on our large projects. And it's not nature alone, it's nature, future climates, the embedded carbon, and the society, people, and how we impact them. Those are the key lenses we look through, and increasingly, those are the experts we need to come and work around the table alongside the engineers. So it's happening and it's changing, and this is a change that's happened over the last 10 years or so. Most of the large consultancies, almost the majority of their work is from environmental and social expertise now. That's my second point. Sorry, the third point, very quickly, the international piece. I think businesses are already doing a lot of this. So you saw some of the stuff that was shown earlier about the metrics being spread across the world. Actually, that's already out of date. I know it's already in a number of countries that weren't on that. And businesses are stepping forward on this. I'm working with lots of companies that are saying, well, we have to do this in the UK, or we have to do this in Europe, so we might as well do this everywhere. And they're stepping and developing and building on these metrics, not trying to reinvent, but trying to adapt so that it works for their business, to actually tell a story that's consistent across their business. And that opens up those opportunities in those other places around the world. So I think there's a huge part to play about that interrelationship with government, with IPPES, and businesses. Happy to have the further discussion on it.
Lovely. So now we're going to just have some closing thoughts from our panellists, and I want them just to say in like one quick sentence, if there's one thing that you should all walk out of the room thinking, what would their point be that you should take away? So James, what point should people take away?
Know the difference between what's big and small and focus on what's big.
That?
It's a really hard question. Possibly preaching to the converted, but kind of encouraging us to think of nature not as a blocker, but as an enabler, enabling nice green space, pollination, climate resilience, kind of taking that framing away with us. Yeah.
Pinched mine, so I'll come up with another one. We need to be thinking here about nature recovery and future resilience of nature, not nature conservation.
And I think nature needs to be understood as part of our critical infrastructure for the 21st century.
And actually, I'd like to pick up on a question that was raised that we didn't really come around to answering around sort of participatory processes. We need to work out ways in which we can actually engage communities to participate in nature recovery, or else it's not going to be sustainable in the long term.
Excellent. So we wanted to leave a little bit of time for networking for you all, because there's some really interesting, fascinating people in this room, and also a chance for you to talk to the speakers in a more informal setting as well. So I'm going to close the formal part of the meeting now. And for doing that, I'm just going to thank Anusha and the Institute of Civil Engineers and the AV people and the venue people who are standing with the coffee as well, because it's been a really, really nice venue. So thank you very much for that. Secondly, I'm going to thank all our speakers, including the ones who are sitting down there as well, for doing a brilliant job. And I want to thank all of you for coming and for being part of this. And finally, I want to thank Kiana Arnott-Job, who did all the work in the organisation as well. So thanks to everybody.